the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz. I'm a freelance journalist in Brussels, and I've covered NATO for more than a decade. So I know a lot about how it's been doing things, but this podcast is going to be about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before, and some are brand new. All of them are aimed at making NATO more responsive and resilient to the threats that definitely get more creative all the time. I'm going to be digging into these ideas with their authors. In this episode, the recommendation, ramp up on Russia. The author, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. Thank you so much for joining me, Ambassador.
It's a great pleasure.
So, Sandy, there are few people in the world who know more about the relationship between NATO and Russia than you do. You're one of the architects of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. You've been the ambassador to Russia as well as to NATO before you were the Deputy Secretary General to NATO. And not just any period of time, you were there in 2014, the year that has, to a large extent, defined the recent relationship between NATO and Russia when the Kremlin annexed Crimea from Ukraine. So I was reading your recommendation with extreme interest because I know you know exactly how things work on the inside. And I'm going to needle you a little bit because now, 4 years after you left Brussels, you say that NATO's gone a bit wimpy on Russia and that its priority for the next decade should be to get tougher. So summarize your paper for me and tell me what your top recommendations are to NATO, and then I'll make you tell us a bit more.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, let me say I have indeed been involved in trying to build a partnership between NATO and Russia going back many years. And I still think it's a goal that we should be pursuing, even if it doesn't look like the most promising moment. But I think the problem that I chose to write about for this series is the fact that NATO has a kind of a nice sounding policy on Russia, which is known as the two-track strategy, defense and dialogue. But it really isn't proving to be all that effective. I mean, the defense piece is working well. We've built up our deterrent quite effectively since 2014. So we don't have to worry too much about the Russians actually launching direct military aggression. But the Russian threat has so many other dimensions, and that's where I think we're falling down on the job. I think part of the problem is that back in 2016, there was a clear split within the alliance. Some of the European allies, the West European allies, wanted to focus on dialogue. Just having defense and deterrence was going to scare publics and be very divisive. But in agreeing to the two-track strategy, we really never agreed what was the purpose, what we're trying to achieve. And as a result, we have pretty much a hollow dialogue. Moreover, our larger policy has done nothing to counter Putin's political warfare against our societies through cyber attacks, disinformation, and other hybrid warfare. We see Russia unconstrained in Ukraine with its ongoing aggression in Donbass. We see their adventurism unchecked in the Middle East and North Africa. They're continuing to behave provocatively in NATO airspace and sea space. And of course, we also have now the potential for Russian intervention, overt intervention in Belarus. They've assassinated Navalny. I mean, basically, we need to do more to convince.
Tried to assassinate
Navalny. Yeah. Clearly we knew what they were trying to do. But my point is, we're going to be in a kind of a vicious circle for years to come if we don't find some way to ratchet up the pressure and convince Putin that the course he's on is not in Russia's best interest, and that it would be much better to come back into the kind of partnership that we thought we were building back in the 90s and the first part of this century, and play by the rules rather than become a rule breaker and a revisionist power that seeks to kind of redivide Europe, have a Yalta II, rather than having a Europe whole, free and at peace. So the paper goes on to then suggest ways to both ramp up the pressure, raise the cost for aggression, make clear that we're not going to compromise when it comes to the sovereignty and independence of sovereign states, but at the same time be more aggressive on diplomacy. In the short term, to manage this competitive relationship, try to lower the temperature, reduce the risks of military conflict using the old toolbox of arms control, confidence building measures, but also over time, hopefully to persuade Putin that we should resolve our differences peacefully. They should get out of Ukraine first and foremost. And then we can begin to rebuild the partnership that we thought we were building up until about 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, let me say one thing. You listed all of these things that Russia is doing, and you say that NATO should find some way to convince Putin this isn't working for him, but he's managed to get away with all of this. That just seems to be the obvious question to start with here. The EU has put sanctions on him for Crimea, and sure, it hurt in the short term, but he didn't change his ways. And I mean, you said that they need to raise the cost, but he's continued and continued and continued, culminating in the Navalny poisoning. Yeah. You don't really see any reason why he should stop.
Well, he doesn't see sufficient reason to stop. I agree with you on that point, because while he has paid a price, I mean, the sanctions imposed back in 2014 did probably reduce Russian GDP by several points in the first year. And even though they've adjusted to the sanctions, their economy is still stagnating. And of course, those sanctions were not as comprehensive as they could be. So I think that it's a good thing that the European Union and the US have stayed more or less on the same page on sanctions, but that's been at the price of kind of a lowest common denominator. We're still basically implementing the Ukraine sanctions that we adopted 6 years ago. We've toughened them in a few ways, but not in a dramatic way that could kind of get Putin's attention. So I think the first part of raising the costs is not just to keep renewing the same old sanctions, but to ratchet them up and set some clear conditions for Putin that if he does comply with the conditions, which are getting out of the occupied parts of eastern Ukraine in accordance with the Minsk agreements, then we will deliver on lifting those sanctions. Right now, the Russians think the sanctions are forever, and that encourages Putin to basically blow us off. So I think we should be tougher with the sanctions, but also clear that there is a way out of this deadlock if Putin is prepared to live up to what he supposedly agreed to when he signed the Minsk agreements.
And we should state here that NATO, of course, doesn't have the tool of sanctions. When you say we, you're talking about the United States as a government, and you're talking about the European governments who have acted as the EU. Because while you talk about sanctions quite a bit in your paper, NATO doesn't have sanctions, right? I mean, other than reducing diplomatic presence of the Russians, which it did, and taking other sort of diplomatic measures, it doesn't have any economic tools.
Absolutely right. In writing this paper, I kind of think about NATO not only as an organization in a specific group of countries, but I think about the wider transatlantic partnership, which encompasses the EU, encompasses countries which are very much like-minded, like Sweden and Finland, tougher than some NATO allies, on Russia, some would say. So we need to think in a kind of a transatlantic framework. There's some things NATO could be doing more effectively. But the important thing is that NATO is supposed to be the venue where we come together with the Europeans to develop grand strategy. We don't always do that. I mean, we have lots of meetings, lots of conversations, but we don't always talk strategy. And of course, now being part of the Scowcroft Center, which is got strategy in its name, I think we should use the opportunity of both the new U.S. administration and the review process that's going on at NATO called NATO 2030 to have a strategic review of the transatlantic approach to Russia.
But tell us from being in the room, what's holding NATO back if they did act to improve the military response after 2014, but if something like that doesn't galvanize the diplomatic will, I mean, what's going to?
Well, I think the first thing, like the famous old rule of holes, when you're in a hole, stop digging. I think we need to be honest with ourselves that apart from the military piece, which is very, existentially important, and I don't in any way diminish it. It's kept us safe, and I think it's had a deterrent effect on any mischief making by Putin directly against NATO countries. And it may have even sort of limited some of his aggressiveness even beyond NATO's borders.
You wouldn't
But
call
overall,
the Skripal poisoning.
Putin is
You
not
wouldn't call the Skripal poisoning mischief making in a NATO country.
Well, that of course he did that one on Skripal. You're talking about?
Yeah, Skripal. Yeah, that was in a NATO country.
Yeah. No, that was a sign that Putin doesn't take our threats seriously enough.
And whose fault is that?
No, I think that's the fault of the NATO countries. Again, we've taken care of ourselves, but it's not enough to circle the wagons and make sure the Russians don't invade our territory. We need to think about broader European security. We need to think about the asymmetric ways that Putin can weaken our societies, whether it's disinformation or running dirty money through our economies, subversion of all kinds, and think about a much more comprehensive strategy, building on the military deterrence, but kind of building out to address these other aspects of Russian behavior which threaten our interests. This is kind of in the spirit of the Biden Build Back Better slogan. Take what we've done well and now broaden it to those areas where we're not having the necessary effect on Putin and changing his calculus in the way that we need to.
Give me a tangible suggestion, a tangible recommendation when you say that NATO could act more forcefully. What are you saying they could do?
Well, we already talked about sanctions, where I think there's scope for a much more stringent set of sanctions that could be applied kind of incrementally if Putin continues to dig in and prove to be intransigent on getting out of eastern Ukraine, which I think is the sort of the first litmus test. I think there's more that we can do to raise the domestic political costs, in addition to the economic costs, by being much more proactive with the release of classified information, even open source information that can document exactly what Putin lies about. He tells his own people that he doesn't even have troops in the Donbass when we know there's thousands of Russian troops there.
But
we haven't been doing much.
is already doing that, and DFR Lab, Atlantic Council's own DFR Lab.
Yeah, but we haven't focused as much on the Russian troop presence and the military aspect of this as we did early on after the invasion. So that's just one example. I think there's other ways to expose the dirty money that underpins the Putin power structure in Russia, which is a very sensitive point for Putin because he sees this as going to his very legitimacy. I think we shouldn't be quite as self-constrained in that regard. And then we should be much more assertive in supporting Ukraine and Georgia, not just working with them on their defense reforms and letting them participate in NATO exercises, but think about ways that'll get Russia's attention, such as actually putting more NATO troops in those countries on a rotating basis, for training purposes. I'm not talking about extending a security guarantee through the back door.
But this got my attention because you said a permanent presence in your paper, a permanent presence in Ukraine and Georgia. And it's always the word permanent, as you well know from having helped write the NATO-Russia Founding Act. It's the word permanent that really does get the Kremlin's attention, doesn't it? Because they say that is a violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act.
Yeah, well, it depends on the scale. The NATO-Russia Founding Act talks about additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. So I'm not suggesting putting a brigade into these countries, but I think to show that we're serious about getting them ready for NATO membership and we're serious about their sovereignty and independence, put a little skin in the game by putting a presence at their training centers. Not extending a security guarantee. We have to be very clear about this. But there are other ways. That may be a very controversial idea. I admit that. This series was supposed to be outside the box. But we could be doing more in terms of the kinds of weapons and equipment that we give to these countries. We can think about, at least short of the membership action plan, which is still very tough, think of other ways to bring them closer to NATO's open door. There's another paper in our volume which talks about moving ahead on the Georgia NATO front, and I think that's, at some point we have to get a little more courage and live up to our own promises and our own values, and not let Putin set the agenda.
Another thing that you said was that Russia is the most immediate threat to transatlantic security and deserves top billing on NATO's agenda for next year. You, having been an ambassador also to South Korea, know Asia very well, and it seems to me that China is taking the top billing. I mean, largely, at the behest of the United States, which is definitely bringing China to the fore. NATO is belatedly looking at China and the possible risks to China and the possibilities for increased partnership as well. So you think that Russia should continue to be at the top of the list and not be kicked off by China?
Well, I think when you look at what are the most immediate threats to NATO's security, to its own borders, and as well as all the other things that Russia has been doing to destabilize our societies, Russia still has earned the top billing in terms of NATO's list of threats, but China is rising fast, and it's certainly already rising to the top of U.S. concerns in terms of our global responsibilities. So, both are front page issues, but I think I put Russia above the fold. But yes, there's a lot that NATO needs to do to show that it's taking the China challenge. It's both a threat and a challenge. And taking it seriously, and I think that already is, and I think it needs to be a central part of this NATO 2030 review that's underway. I think that this creates anxieties among some of the allies that we're trying to turn NATO into a global security organization, and I don't think that's what the United States has in mind. But there are plenty of aspects of Chinese behavior and conduct that are already directly encroaching upon European security, whether you look at the issues of 5G and the security of telecommunications, when you look at all the important transportation infrastructure, ports, and other facilities that they're, in many cases, buying or funding through the Belt and Road Initiative. These are things that NATO needs to look at in a collective way, and come up with a common approach to minimize the security risks to the alliance that China could pose, even in the short and medium term. Questions about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, maybe a little farther away, but there too, the world is getting smaller and smaller, and those allies that have still global maritime capabilities may need to do more, as the UK and France have already done to some extent, in helping the US in managing the China threat. But I think the most important thing Europe could be doing is to take more responsibility for security and defense in its own neighborhood, and allow the US to perhaps free up some of its own resources to deal more effectively with the China threat in the Asia Pacific region. I have in mind a kind of a more equitable division of labor. I'd rather call it strategic responsibility within NATO rather than strategic autonomy from the United States and NATO. But I think this would be a much more healthy partnership, and would put the burden sharing debate behind us once and for all.
How much can you do on the dialogue part of this, though? And you do recommend beefing up the dialogue when the NATO-Russia Council is basically dead. I mean, there are, they meet, I don't know, once or twice a year now. And basically from what we hear of the readouts of these meetings, both sides sit across the table and read out their list of complaints, and then nothing happens. I mean, you've been there through those meetings. Yeah. And I mean, is that even an avenue anymore that's worthwhile?
Well, I think it's still a viable forum if both sides decide to use it. And that's why I think NATO does need to be a little bit more daring in how it tries to use not only the NATO-Russia Council, but other forums, including the OSCE. When we agreed that we were not going to resume business as usual back in 2016, we've taken a kind of narrow interpretation of what that means. I think talking on different levels to the Russian military about potential risks from their provocative air activities, or about some of the more provocative exercises that they hold, or the ones that they do without prior notification. I think those are valid subjects to manage risks. It's not about business as usual, but it's about preventing the current somewhat tense relationship from spinning out of control.
But there you're talking about the Sakharov-Gerasimov line, aren't you, rather than the NATO-Russia Council?
That's that's important, but we don't have the military representatives in Brussels meeting anymore. We don't have working level contacts. There used to be a liaison officer at SHAPE. Now, a lot of that was exploited by Russia for espionage purposes, and we have to be careful about that. But I think
Gerasimov never picks up the phone. That's literally what we've been told by successive SECWARs.
Yeah, well, that's happened. Even there's their brilliant new shiny command center in Moscow. Sometimes you can't get them to answer the phone there either. But one thing that NATO did agree in 2016 was that one of the legitimate subjects for the NATO-Russia Council was risk reduction.
Right.
But not much has come of that. So I think we need to challenge the Russians. I say this in my paper, challenge the Russians to actually talk seriously about some of the proposals that allies have made, but even Russians have made at different periods of time. This is one of those cases where we have similar ideas, but not at the same time. Let's talk about strengthening this immortal Vienna document, which has a lot of provisions for transparency. The Russians circumvent many of those provisions. Let's look for ways to tighten it up, and in the process, maybe create incentives on a more voluntary basis to stop the provocative air incidents that continue to occur.
And just to explain, the Vienna document is about declaring your troop activities, your exercises, right? The transparency of how many troops you're having where, staging exercises that would, I mean, basically the SNAP exercises that Russia has stages very near to NATO borders would normally be covered under the Vienna document.
For example, the Vienna document says you need to provide advance notification, and you are required to have a very elaborate inspection regime for exercises over 10,000. So what do the Russians do? They have one giant exercise, which they announce in the media has 120,000 troops, but they tell us in Vienna, oh no, these are separate activities, each with 9,999 troops.
And the invitations never arrive.
Right. And the SNAP exercises, there's an exception for that, so you keep your troops on their toes. But they use that so frequently that it becomes a real source of tension, and could even, in the worst case scenario, lead to misinterpretation and actual military incidents. So, people have proposed quotas, maybe one or two of those a year. You might even be able to come up with some kind of notification regime where you tell everybody but the troops involved confidentially that there's an exercise coming, so that people won't overreact.
Which is in their interest as well, obviously, and the Russians know that. But this is just one of those things that they know will be stuck, and so they bring it up as a broken record, sort of. I want to get to a couple more things before we run out of time, and I'm saving the presidential elections in the U.S. for our kicker. But before we get to that, New START. You do talk about the fact that INF is dead, never to return, but that you believe that there is a mutual interest in extending New START for at least a year or two, so that there could be this possibility of bringing in other nuclear powers and covering other weapons. There have been some promising signals now at the end of the Trump administration. Where do you think that's leading? Do you think these are credible? I mean, we don't have much longer. A couple, 3 more months, 4 more months until New START is dead without an extension.
Yeah. It's not clear whether the Trump administration is going to be able to kind of come to a final agreement. I hope they do, because it was not a bad package in which there would be a 1-year extension of New START, and then a kind of a political commitment to freeze all other nuclear weapons. I think the problem is that the US wants to have at least some kind of verification or transparency for this freeze, and the Russians are saying, if it's only for 1 year, this is far too complicated. And indeed, it would be very complicated, because verifying inventories of tactical nuclear weapons, which are in all kinds of secure locations, would require an extraordinary degree of openness that isn't going to happen just overnight, particularly for a 1-year agreement. So it may now, with the election over, be up to the new Biden administration to probably just try to go for a straight extension of New START, whether it's 1 year or 5 years.
But they'll have a month to do it, 6 weeks to do
or
it.
Even fewer days. I think it's February the 5th or something like that,
exactly,
when they would have to do it. But I think that's possible.
Right.
Because, at least in the US, we're able to use this extension authority without having to go back to the Senate for ratification. The Russians have some parliamentary procedure required, but we know Mr. Putin can get that parliament to stand up and salute whenever he snaps his fingers. So if the Trump Putin deal is not consummated, I think we can still get the extension, and then step back and think about what is the best follow-on agreement. Clearly, as numbers come down in the US and in Russia, there is a case for factoring in the forces of third countries, both the UK and France on the NATO side, and China on the other side. And these are not necessarily blocks. I mean, but China is expanding its nuclear arsenal. The intelligence community thinks they're going to actually double or triple their arsenal over the coming years. So we need to bring them into the process. And then we have to decide what other categories of US and Russian weapons are the most concerning when it comes to stability and security. There may be a lot of tactical weapons that are in storage and not really usable. They don't have delivery systems. So we have to decide how much are we prepared to use our negotiating capital to get every single last one of them included, or whether there are somewhat more limited approaches. But I do think that I do think that
forever about the deadline. It just seems that when you keep saying that we need to do these things, it's baffling that we're not further along this timeline, isn't it?
Well, the Trump administration has never been really enthusiastic about arms control. Some people think that this proposal, with the element of a freeze on all nuclear warheads, was an effort to actually limit the options of the incoming Biden administration by kind of forcing them to pursue an all warheads approach rather than something that might be more differentiated. I don't know if that's true, but in any case, it's now academic, since we know what the next administration will be. And they certainly are, I think, committed to an aggressive approach to arms control, but also a tough approach to Russia, sort of in the spirit of my paper. I did mention that on INF, that while the INF treaty itself is not going to be brought back from the dead, it's still worth thinking about how in a follow-on agreement we could perhaps resurrect some elements of constraint on intermediate range forces. I mean, the Russians violated INF, but now they may be wondering if that was such a great idea when the US has free reign to deploy not only cruise missiles, but ballistic missiles with very short warning times in the European theater, which was, the Russian concern about the original INF dual track decision back in 1979, 1980. So if there's some way to set some limits, and I suggest in the paper banning nuclear armed versions of these intermediate range missiles while allowing conventionally armed versions, might be a way of at least minimizing the dangers for strategic stability and scenarios in which you could have uncontrolled escalation. It's a tough thing to verify, but we were able to do that in the New START agreement, when we are able to go in and check that under the hood, basically, whether there are nuclear devices or non-nuclear devices on a particular missile.
But as you say, and as we need to wrap up, let's talk about how all of this is now going to fall on a new administration. We now have the result of the U.S. election, and I mean, will a Biden presidency see Russia in a different way than the Trump administration? I mean, I still find so many things puzzling. I was at the Helsinki summit. I still can't believe we don't know what happened in this private meeting, and we'll probably never know. What, if you could just sum up, what do you think will be the hallmarks of the Biden presidency when it comes to the relationship with Russia?
Well, I think you're right. We may never know what happened at Helsinki. Looks like the Trump administration may remove any documentary evidence from all those private conversations with Putin, and
if there was any,
and if there ever is a Trump presidential library, we'll get to read them. Who knows? Anyway, but on your basic question, I think that the problem with the Trump administration was you had President Trump's view of Russia, which was very benign. He never said an unkind word about Putin. He took Putin's word for it on the election interference rather than the U.S. intelligence community's assessment. But then you had the administration, which maintained a pretty tough line on Russia, supported most of the work on NATO defense and deterrence, continued to maintain and even fine-tune the sanctions regime, convinced Trump to take a tough line after the Skripal affair.
Right.
And so when Trump said no one's been tougher on Russia, it wasn't exactly true about him, but it was true about his administration. So I think thankfully with Biden, you're going to get a much more coherent approach. I don't think you're going to have this sort of schizophrenia. And I think it will be a very realistic approach. I think Biden has spoken very tough words about Russia. And I think that there's not going to be any desire for an unprincipled reset. I think Biden probably learned many lessons from the 2008 reset, and will want to continue to kind of keep the pressure on Russia until it changes its behavior in places like Ukraine or Georgia, or continues to violate human rights and undermine Western democracies. But I think he will try to limit the competition and limit the risks and seek agreements where there's a common interest, engage with the Russians on areas where they may have a role to play, whether it's in the Middle East or solving the North Korean nuclear issue. I think he doesn't feel that talking with Russia is rewarding their bad behavior, but it's a way to try to convince them to end their bad behavior. And so I think it's very much in the spirit of my paper, be tougher on pushing back, but also be aggressive with the diplomacy in the hopes that we can kind of break the deadlock and move to a much more constructive kind of relationship with Russia. Hopefully he'll come up with ways to kind of address constituencies in Russia beyond the Kremlin, because I think there's a growing restiveness in Russia that we've seen in Khabarovsk and in other parts of the country. People are getting a little tired.
Former secret city, isn't it? It's a beautiful city, and that was exciting to see what was happening in Khabarovsk.
Yeah. So there may be a future generation that doesn't watch Russian state TV, is a little bit more open-minded about the West, who may have increasing influence, and maybe they'll have their day in power, hopefully before 2036, which is still now the last year Putin can remain president.
Now.
For now. But I think we need to certainly prepare for change inside Russia, even as we deal with the aggressive and revisionist Russia that we confront today.
Well, certainly it's going to be a new leaf, which a second Trump administration would not have been. So that's something to look forward to, and you can slip them a copy of your paper and all kinds of ideas there. But we're going to have to wrap up now, Sandy. Thank you so much, Ambassador, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, for sharing your ideas about how to ramp up on Russia. You can find all 20 ideas at atlanticcouncil.org, and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to everyone else for joining us.